In this presentation, we're going to be looking at an overview of community corrections, the goals and evidence-based practices from Chapter 1 in your book.
Now, the learning objectives for this chapter include define corrections and its purpose, explain the role of corrections at each of three main decision points, analyze the theories behind correctional goals of punishment and rehabilitation, and then finally explain the importance of evidence-based practices to evaluating the effectiveness in achieving correctional goals. Now, these learning objectives are going to be found in a combination of the textbook and the video presentation. Some material will be in both, but some material will only be in one. You're going to be responsible for all of the learning objectives, no matter how they are delivered to you. So let's talk about the correctional dilemma. There are approximately 7 million people, about 3% of the total adult population, that are currently under some form of correctional supervision. This includes things like community corrections, which could be either post-adjudication, before they're found, or after they're found guilty, or pre-adjudication, which occurs before they are found guilty. With the biggest emphasis we're going to talk about is what was traditionally called probation.
During this semester, we are going to spend some time talking about local Texas material, and you'll find these in the presentation. This is additional material that's not going to be in your textbook, so keep in mind whenever you see this little Texas map with the flag embedded in it, that this is something you're probably going to see on the exam, and it's going to be on local material. So we've already talked about the number of people on parole or within community corrections nationwide and how many millions it was. Well, here in Texas, we're going to be looking at, under direct supervision, you're looking about 239,000 people who in June of 2017 at least were on probation or some type of direct supervision after being convicted of either a felony or a misdemeanor. In direct supervision, they're probably reporting at least once a month. They've got rules that they've got to follow and so forth. Got another 113,000 individuals who are on what is called indirect supervision. These individuals are probably going to be reporting less. They've probably already done fairly well on their parole or excuse me, probation, and they're not having to report as often. Now, in addition, there are another 21,000 individuals who are under some type of supervision for pretrial supervision. This can be, like a condition of probation, or it can be what's called a deferred prosecution. Deferred prosecution is different than deferred adjudication. Deferred adjudication occurs when the judge determines that you you will not be convicted if you meet the conditions of probation. At the end of that term, your conviction goes away. Deferred prosecution is handled through the prosecutor's office, and if you meet certain conditions that they've got, then they drop the charges. So it's actually kind of you never had any type of conviction at all with that. So in total, there's over 370,000 individuals who are under some type of supervision within our courts.
Okay, so let's again talk about the different what we call intermediate sanctions levels, or different sanctions that are an alternative to incarceration. So we're going to talk from the least restrictive on up to the most restrictive. And the least restrictive is seen as fines or day fines. We don't see many day fines around this area, but a day fine is based upon your income level. You're fined, so many days of income. So if you make $1,000 a month, or make $10 a day, you'd make, if you got a 3-day fine, you'd be fined $30. Again, we don't find that much around here, so that's least restrictive. The next up could be certain fees that would have to be imposed for as a condition of whatever punishment you're receiving. Forfeitures and impoundment, losing the items that you earned from the your illegal ways. Could be outpatient treatment, particularly in use with drug courts. So that it's condition of you're staying out of jail, you have to go through the treatment program, and in an outpatient basis, not as restrictive as the inpatient type programs. Inundation interlock, things that are put on people that are charged and convicted with drunk driving, so they can't drive their car unless they blow into it and they're sober. Then the next level is the regular supervised probation. Generally, we're talking about a once a month type reporting and so forth. Above that could be often a condition, and quite often is a condition of your supervised probation, is going to be that community service where you have to go out in kind of a symbolic restitution to the community. Then the victim offender reconciliation or mediation programs, where you actually sit down with the person you offended and kind of work things out. Next level is going to be home confinement, and a little bit more home confinement with electronic monitoring. The only difference is between the two is one of them you have to stay home, the other one you have to stay home, and we're going to make sure you stay home because we've got a way of monitoring. Next level is day reporting, where you have to report every single day to your probation officer, kind of part of intensive probation, which is they've got it added above that. Then they've got the residential community programs, or the halfway houses, where you stay in the halfway house, you have some freedom, you can go out in the community at various times for various things, but you've got curfews that you have to be back in. Then the work release, this is a little bit more severe confinement, but you get out at times, you get out of the county jail to go work during the day. You just got to get back, at night or even on weekends. Weekend sentences type system. Next is the therapeutic community or drug treatment programs, in which you are housed in a drug treatment program where you can't leave. And finally listed one that we don't really see hardly anymore because they didn't work and they were very expensive, were the boot camps, which were an intensive program where you went through a military type training over a short period of time. The intermediate sentencing, indeterminate sentencing, was very popular in the 1930s to mid-70s. It's still used in felony cases here in Texas today. It was, again, the primary sentencing philosophy between the 30s and 70s. And in this case, the judge decides who will go to prison, but the parole board decides when they get out. In some states, they actually would sentence you to 5 to 99, and somewhere in that time frame. In Texas, what happens is you get an actual sentence, and after you've served a certain percentage of that sentence, the parole board can then decide whether or not you should be released on parole. It's a discretionary parole system, so that you have to behave in prison, you got to do certain things, maybe get certain training programs and so forth that will lead them to release you more quickly. Determinate sentencing, on the other hand, is a sentencing philosophy that focuses on consistency, specifying an exact amount or a very narrow range of time to be served. For instance, in Texas, if you're sentenced on a state jail felony, you can be sentenced up to 2 years in state jail, and it's very specific. Up until a couple of years ago, there was even no good time. Now you can get good time, but the good time's up to the judge, not to the prison system, whether you'll be awarded it. So very specifics on that. In the federal system, when they did away with federal parole, you have to serve about 80 to 85% before you can get out on your good time. So again, very specifics. The American Friends Service Committee had said that we should be looking at the harm done by the offense and the offender's culpability. How, they the getaway driver, are they the gunman or whatever, how culpable are they to the offense, in determining what this determinate sentencing should be. David Fogel, a penologist, said in his book on justice model, said that we should stop trying to punish the individuals, but treat them all alike. Some of the things that come with this determinate sentencing are mandatory minimum sentences, kind of the big move, the truth in sentencing, where people aren't paroling out. At one time, the average life sentence was paroled out in Texas in 7 years when our prisons were overcrowded. 7 years on a life sentence. How many people on the jury would expect this person to get out in just 7 years? So that came with the truth in sentencing. Then the three strike laws, where if you've been convicted 3 times of felony offenses, you get a lengthy sentence or life in prison. Texas, we have the Habitual Criminal Act. After 3 strikes, you can get up to a minimum sentencing, a minimum mandatory sentencing of 25 years. And with this philosophy of treating everybody the same come the sentencing guidelines. Now, many of the federal courts or the Supreme Courts have struck down many of these sentencing guidelines as being unconstitutional because they violate that kind of separation between the courts and the legislature. They say that's the court's realm, but then they can be more voluntary guidelines than anything else.
Now we'll go ahead and talk about kind of what we call the paradox, where you've got kind of the shift in correctional policies, the way we do things. As we said, 1930s, 1970s, we had this indeterminate sentencing where basically the prison system kind of got to decide how long you spent in prison. We've kind of moved forward from that, and now we've got a kind of a shift in policy. Correctional policy can shift often between what we can afford and changes in public perspective, what is important to local constituents. Things like when we had a move against drunk drivers, the MAD program, the Mothers Against Drunk Driving, they were able to change policies throughout the nation on our drunk driving charges, and people started spending time in jail for drunk driving, thing that was very rare prior to their move, or not as common as today. Public opinion about community corrections, again, has gotten better when you're talking about mainly non-violent offenders, when people start looking about how expensive the prison systems are. Just kind of some of the figures from the Administrative Office of the U.S. Courts from 2017. Simply to detain someone in jail, the annual cost of keeping a person in jail, the pre-trial, hopefully you're not going to keep them in there for a full year prior to the trial, but many people do it depending on how the seriousness of the charge. You're looking at about $31,000. To imprison them after they've been sentenced, convicted of an offense, there's going to be a little bit more. We're talking about $34,000. To place them into some type of residential re-entry center, you're looking at a lower cost of $29,000, but it's still quite expensive. To supervise a person in the community before their trial, you're looking about $4,000. And then after their sentencing, there's a little bit more cost. You may be doing drug testing and so forth. That's going to bring the cost up. But you're still looking at only $4,300 per year, which is about $30,000 a year cheaper than putting them in prison. So you see, prison's very expensive. And that's why you can kind of get the public to agree to maybe not keep someone in prison if we can do other alternate means of corrections. There are 3 major decision points that corrections has a kind of a role in. One of them is bail. And bail is simply the monetary payment deposited with the court to ensure the defendant returns to the next court date in exchange for said release. It can be through a bail-ending agency. It actually can be through kind of a pretrial release program. It can be through personal recognizance bond or PR bonds. And quite often in these situations, you may want somebody out on the street where they can still contribute to society, they can still work, but at the same time you want to keep an eye on them, and that's where the community corrections can come in. They can be kind of giving them the same services they do for probationers, to kind of make sure they check in with them and don't do things they're not supposed to. Community corrections also works with sentencing. Community corrections agencies and programs perform a very important function in implementing the sentence that are imposed by judges. At the basic level, a correction sentence is a social control mechanism for convicted offenders, but it also keeps citizens law-abiding throughout that through a general deterrent. So kind of everybody looking at it. And community corrections can be involved in early parts of it. The pre-sentence investigations is an aspect that we'll see corrections or community corrections probation departments running. And then reentries, activities or programs conducted to prepare the prisoners to return safely to the community and live as law-abiding citizens. These can include programs, training programs, and drug counseling programs and so forth that they receive while they're in prison, but it also can be in reentry programs such as halfway houses or correctional kind of a minimum custody facility where the inmate's not that they're let out of prison, but they've also got someone keeping an eye on them to kind of make sure they slowly re-enter society. So it's not, someone's been in prison for 30 years, you let them on the street and you got to go fend for yourself. It's not quite like that with these reentry programs. You got someone to make sure you're eating, make sure you're going to work, and kind of an easing into society type rules. Okay, pretrial supervision is the correctional supervision of a defendant who's not yet been convicted of a crime. So there are times when we're going to let somebody out of jail, but we want to kind of keep track of it. It's got 4 different functions. First is to account for defendants' whereabouts. We want to make sure they're where they're supposed to be, not going where they're not. It allows the defendants to prepare for their upcoming court appearance. It also allows them, and kind of more importantly, to continue working within the community to provide for their family, to provide for themselves, and so forth. And it keeps bed space open in jail for defendants who you really don't want to release, those violent offenders, those people who are more than likely to commit more crimes if they are left out in the field. So some of the sentencing decisions that we have to look at, the vast majority of offenders can be punished in the community. There are sanctions that are available that are much more cost effective, yet reach that goal of preventing recidivism and, actually are punitive in some ways. So they're being punished. Intermediate sanctions offered a different level. We kind of went through the list in the earlier slide of those different progressive intermediate sanctions. A spectrum of community supervision strategies that can give the judge great latitude in selecting punishment that closely fits the circumstances of the crime and particularly of the offender. We want to not just match the punishment to the crime, but match it to what is going to best help the offender. I mean, let's face it, you can't send everybody in a drug rehab program because not every defendant has a drug problem. Community, supervision or maybe community service is not going to be for everybody. There's some people physically unable to do manual labor and so forth. So you got to kind of set the sentencing to be what is best not only for society but for that particular defendant. Now we'll talk about the reentry decisions. Back in 1967, the President's Commission on Law Enforcement and Administrative Justice said that institutions tend to isolate offenders from society, both physically and psychologically, cutting them off from schools, jobs, families, and other supports, and increasing the probability that the label of criminal will be indelibly impressed upon them. We kind of call this institutionalizing, labeling, and so forth. The goal of reintegration is likely to be furthered much more readily by working with the offender in the community rather than by incarceration. Today's term is reentry, requires an offender to participate in programs that are to develop legitimate accomplishments and opportunities for success, at least to make them much more likely of being successful, particularly being successful in not recidivating or reoffending. So the pre-release programs are minimum security, community-based or institutional settings for offenders who have spent time in prison and are nearing that release, and its focus includes both transitioning, securing a job, and reestablishing family connections. With these programs, that kind of like halfway houses, the offender has more freedoms than they had in prison, but they've still got some rather stringent rules to follow. They've got curfews they've got to be inside at a certain hour. They may be having to go through more drug counseling or maybe job training. If they don't have a job, they may have to apply for so many jobs in order to stay within this pre-release program. Parole, on the other hand, is the early privileged release from a penal or correctional institution of a convicted offender. It's the continual custody of the state, so you're not completely free, but you're not locked up anymore. They serve the remainder of their sentence under supervision, very similar to probation, but again, these offenders have already been to prison. They are again still kind of wards of the state. Parole is kind of the main avenue that individuals who are sentenced under, places where they have an indeterminate sentence get out of prison. A good number, probably a high percentage of the prisoners in Texas prison system will parole out and won't serve their entire sentence. They're going to get out early if they behave themselves in prison. Now we'll talk about some of the theories behind community correction goals, and we've been talking about protecting the public through specific deterrence, rehabilitation through the risk-need responsivity, the healing the victim and community through the restorative justice programs, and finally the integrated theory of community supervision, the participation process model. So first we're going to talk about protecting the public through the specific deterrence, the value of community corrections. An offender on community supervision is thought that they'll refrain from committing even technical violations or committing new crimes if, after consideration of the cost versus the benefits, the consequences for the misbehavior are certain and severe enough that the sanctions will outweigh the benefit. But this assumes that offenders, like all people, consider the cost and the benefits of their action. So you kind of have to take it with a grain of salt. This is kind of where we want the severity of the crime to kind of meet the severity of the punishment. Where, I guess kind of the example I've always used, how many people would be murdered if the fine for murder were only $1? The severity of the punishment would not be, and quite frankly, that meant many people would be murdered, because most people aren't going to kill people because of their, I guess the best way of putting it is because it's just not right to do it. So kind of look at that. Now again, we're going to assume that offenders are going to consider this, but you also have to assume that they believe that there's a good chance they'll get caught. Because if they don't think they're going to get caught, then it doesn't matter how severe the crime is. To kind of keep them from doing it. Now, the rehabilitative through risk needs responsivity theory, let's first look at what the rehabilitation is. The goal of rehabilitation of correction systems in the process in which offenders are exposed to treatment programs and skills training in order to change their thinking process and thus changing their behavior. So with the risk-need responsivity, the theory of rehabilitation is that suggests focusing on treating those high-risk offenders, matching the correctional intervention with the crimogenic needs, and implementing treatments according to the offender's learning style and their personal characteristics. Spending more time at those high-risk offenders, not necessarily ignoring the low-risk offenders, but not putting the emphasis on the low-risk offenders. You want to help society as much as possible. And of course, you probably want to know what criminogenic needs are, and those are problems, habits, or deficits that are directly related to the individual's involvement in criminal behavior. Kind of think of it as drug use, poverty problems, traditional things that will make you more likely to be offenders.
And oftentimes, the offenders are more likely to receive some type of treatment when they're under community supervision than when they are in prison. So you more likely get them in drug rehab or get them, job training and so forth. So that's kind of the theory behind this move. Now, restorative justice is the sentencing philosophies and practice that emphasize the offender taking responsibility for their actions and then trying to repair the harm that they've done. The harm that they've done not just to the victim, but the surrounding community and to society as a whole. And it includes forms of victim-offender mediation, where you get the victim and the offender together and you let the offender know what type of harm they have caused to the victim. You have reparation panels and circle sentencing, and they will kind of sentence, if for want of a better word, the offender to do things like pay monetary fines, pay restitution to the victim, and quite often they can do community service as symbolic restitution when, quite frankly, some offenders don't have any money. These type programs are more helpful for kind of youthful offenders and more helpful when you get to the offenders who are not career criminals. It's not geared toward those, but it's mostly geared toward the youthful and first-time offenders. The integrated theory of community supervision, that participation model, it suggests that offenders' compliance and active participation, along with the officer's supervision strategies of communication, casework, and leverage, are necessary to achieve offender accountability, offender risk, and need reduction and public safety. The change is mediated by the offender's motivation, the parental significant other support, or officer-client relationships and qualities. Now, the integrated theory of supervision, the participation model, the probation officers use strategies such as communication, casework, and leverages to achieve their goals. Communication includes things like listening, clarifying expectations, giving praise and encouragement for desirable behavior, and confronting offenders when they commit undesirable behavior. So keep an open dialogue between the two. Casework strategies include assessing problems, establishing long-term goals, and assisting the client with implementing steps to meet these goals. And finally, leverage is the adverse sanctions either applied to or threatened that are imposed by the court and probation officers as a consequence of rule-violating behavior. Now, evidence-based practices in community corrections are techniques that show through some systematic evaluation research what is the most effective with offenders. You just don't try a program and say it works because it sounds good. Kind of a good point on this would be the boot camps that, they sound good. Some places still use them, but they just don't work as well and they cost a lot of money. So when you do the research, the evidence-based research, you kind of look at the outcomes. And principally when we're looking at outcomes in corrections, we're looking at recidivism. How many people will commit new offenses after they've been through the system? If a high percentage does, then your program's not successful. So we're looking at the outcomes and evaluating the programs. If they don't work, hey, we'll try something else. Well, that concludes this presentation. Next up, we're going to be looking at community-based corrections in Chapter 12 of your book.